It's late. Maybe you're wandering through a supermarket after work, half awake, pushing a cart beneath those humming fluorescent lights. You roll past the vegetables, the bread, the frozen dinners, and almost automatically, you grab a gallon of milk. Nothing unusual about that. At least, that's what it feels like. But if you stop and think about it for a second, it's actually bizarre. Imagine a wolf doing the same thing. Or a horse. Or a chimpanzee. Imagine any adult mammal deliberately looking for milk. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Because for almost every mammal that's ever existed, milk serves one purpose and one purpose only. It's food for babies. That's it. Once childhood ends, milk disappears from the menu. Not temporarily. Not until next season. Forever. And yet somehow, humans took a substance designed for infancy and turned it into a global business, a cultural tradition, and a daily ritual. We splash it into coffee. We bake with it. We pour it over cereal. We keep it in our refrigerators as if it has always belonged there. Wait, why? Why are adult humans still drinking milk at all? Why can your body handle something that fossil records suggest most adult mammals can't digest? And how did one of evolution's strangest exceptions become one of the most ordinary items in your kitchen? The answer starts with a tiny biological detail. Because the most ordinary thing in your refrigerator may also be one of evolution's strangest exceptions. To answer that question, we need to talk about a small enzyme that was never supposed to become famous. It's called lactase. When you're born, your body produces plenty of it. Lactase breaks down lactose, the sugar found in milk, allowing newborn mammals to digest the first food they'll ever consume. Without lactase, milk would be useless. Simple enough. And nature usually follows a predictable script. A baby drinks milk, the baby grows, lactase production fades, story over. Researchers estimate that this pattern shows up across almost the entire mammal family tree. Lions, zebras, elephants, chimpanzees, different species, same switch. Which creates a fascinating puzzle. If evolution tends to be efficient, why keep manufacturing an enzyme you no longer need? After all, biology isn't free. Every protein costs energy. Every cell costs energy. Every enzyme costs energy, not waste. Survival. So what happened? Why did some human populations end up breaking a rule that seems to apply to almost every other mammal on Earth? Why did a switch designed to shut off stay on? And here's the important part. Evolution rarely keeps something running without a good reason. A powerful reason. A survival reason. And that reason begins with a relationship that changed human history. Imagine standing somewhere on the grasslands of Eastern Africa roughly 10,000 years ago. The scene would feel strangely familiar and completely alien. Humans are still hunting, still gathering, still following seasonal patterns that had shaped countless generations before them. But something new is beginning to emerge. Animals are no longer seen only as food. They're becoming partners. Fossil records suggest that communities in different regions gradually started managing cattle, sheep, and goats instead of simply pursuing them as prey. At first, the benefits were obvious enough. Meat, hides, bones, useful resources. Then somebody noticed something extraordinary. You didn't actually have to kill the animal. You could keep it alive. And if it stayed alive, it could keep providing value tomorrow, and next week, and next month. Suddenly, food wasn't a one-time reward. It became renewable. A moving pantry, a living investment. Researchers believe periods of drought and environmental instability made this realization especially important. When crops struggled and wild animals became harder to find, livestock offered something precious: reliability. Milk wasn't just a drink. It was nutrition that kept showing up again. And again. And again. But here's the twist. At this stage, the story wasn't really about human biology. It was about human behavior. Not genetics. Strategy. Not evolution. Innovation. The habit came first. The adaptation came later. Humans changed their relationship with animals, and that decision would eventually change humans themselves. Imagine traveling across dry land where rain never seems to arrive when you need it. For pastoral communities living in the Horn of Africa, survival often depended on movement. Herds moved constantly. Families moved constantly. Water sources shifted constantly. Everything moved, except hunger. In places where resources could vanish within weeks, livestock became something more than wealth. They became security. Milk offered calories. Milk offered minerals. Milk offered hydration. 3 survival tools wrapped into one resource. At first glance, it sounds like a perfect solution. People had cattle. People drank milk. Problem solved. Except, not quite, because most adults back then probably couldn't digest lactose particularly well. That's the part people often miss. The cultural behavior arrived before the biological adaptation. Fresh milk could cause bloating, cramping, and digestive discomfort for many adults. Hardly the kind of thing you'd expect natural selection to reward. So humans did what humans always do. They improvised. They experimented. They adapted. Instead of abandoning milk, they changed it. Milk was fermented, cultured, transformed into new foods with lower lactose content. Across different regions, people discovered ways of turning a biological limitation into a cultural solution. And that's when a pattern begins to appear. First comes the behavior. Then comes the biology. Culture writes the first draft. Evolution edits the final version. You can see this pattern throughout human history. Humans open a new door. Evolution decides who walks through it. Now let's head thousands of kilometers north. The environment feels completely different. The climate is harsher. The winters are longer. The margin for error is smaller. Researchers studying ancient Europe point to farming communities living roughly 5,000 to 7,000 years ago. In some regions, winter stretched on for months. Sunlight could be limited. Food availability shifted with the seasons. Under those conditions, every dependable calorie mattered. Every dependable nutrient mattered. Every dependable advantage mattered. And milk offered something unusual. Consistency. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't unlimited. But it was there, year after year. Then, somewhere within these populations, a tiny mutation appeared. Tiny. Almost invisible. A small genetic change that allowed lactase production to continue into adulthood. Most mutations fade away. This one didn't. Why? Because sometimes a small advantage is enough. An adult who could digest milk gained access to nutrients that others couldn't fully use. Researchers still debate exactly how strong those advantages were and how they varied from region to region. But current evidence points to powerful selective pressure favoring lactase persistence in certain populations. And then, something remarkable happened. The mutation spread quickly. Not quick by modern standards, quick by evolutionary standards. Generation after generation, its frequency increased. A switch that normally turned off stayed on. A tiny genetic variation started reshaping entire populations. Not because it made people stronger, not because it made people smarter, because it helped them survive. And sometimes that's all evolution needs. Not a miracle, just a small edge repeated over thousands of years. If you're still with me, subscribe, because the next part reveals why a single digestive enzyme may have changed the map of the modern world. For a while, scientists thought this was one story, one mutation, one adaptation, one explanation. But ancient DNA had other ideas. As researchers began extracting genetic material from human remains buried thousands of years ago, the picture became far more complicated. History suddenly gained a new source of evidence. Not artifacts, not tools, not skeletons, genomes. And those genomes started telling surprising stories. In parts of Scandinavia, lactase persistence became widespread. Elsewhere, it remained relatively uncommon. In regions such as East Asia, populations often followed entirely different dietary paths rather than developing widespread adult lactose digestion. Then there were pastoral societies across Central Asia and Mongolia. Communities deeply connected to livestock. Communities that consumed dairy regularly. Yet communities whose genetic patterns didn't always resemble those of Northern Europe. Wait, how does that make sense? Shouldn't the same challenge produce the same solution? Apparently not. Some populations adapted biologically. Some adapted culturally. Some adapted through a combination of both. The deeper scientists dug, the less this looked like a single evolutionary event. Milk wasn't one experiment. It was dozens of experiments unfolding in parallel. Independent experiments, regional experiments, human experiments. And those experiments left fingerprints that still exist today. A DNA sequence can hint at migration routes. A digestive enzyme can reveal ancestral environments. Even a glass of milk can contain clues about thousands of years of survival decisions. What began as a nutritional choice became something much bigger. A biological record of where your ancestors lived and how they made it through. At this point, you might think the mystery is solved. People who could drink milk had the advantage. People who couldn't were left behind. Nice, clean story. The problem is that history almost never works that neatly. Researchers estimate that billions of people alive today remain partially or fully lactose intolerant as adults. And yet those same populations built thriving civilizations, vast trade networks, powerful states, philosophical traditions, and technological breakthroughs without depending heavily on fresh milk. So was lactase persistence some kind of evolutionary upgrade? Not exactly. A trait that helps in one environment can be irrelevant somewhere else. A solution that works in one region may never be needed in another. An advantage during one era can become neutral during the next. That's evolution. Not one perfect version of humanity. Different solutions to different problems. Not a ladder leading upward. A landscape spreading outward. The more closely you look, the harder it becomes to tell a simple story. because evolution was never chasing perfection.
It was chasing survival.
And survival has more than one answer. Which brings us to the part of the story that changes everything. The easy answer is that humans drink milk because we happen to like it. But that explanation falls apart pretty quickly. The second easy answer is that milk was some extraordinary superfood that transformed human history all by itself. That doesn't quite work either. The real answer is stranger and more revealing. This isn't a story about milk. It's a story about what happens when a species starts changing its own environment faster than its body can keep up. Think about the sequence. First, humans domesticated animals. Then they started relying on dairy. Then dairy became valuable enough to affect survival. Then genetic traits that supported dairy consumption began spreading through certain populations. Cause, effect, response, again and again. That's the pattern. Humans build the environment rebuilds humans. Most animals adapt to the world they inherit. Humans do something different. We reshape the world first. Then we adapt to the world we created. Beavers build dams. Birds build nests. Ants build colonies. Humans build entirely new ecological systems and then spend generations living inside the consequences. Wait, do you see what's happening? The cattle came first. The gene came later. The habit came first. The adaptation came later. The environmental change came first. The biological response came later. That's the real story hidden inside a glass of milk. And it may be one of the clearest examples of what makes our species unique. Now bring all of this back to yourself. Maybe you start your morning with a latte and never think twice about it. Maybe there's a carton of milk sitting in your refrigerator right now. Or maybe even a small glass leaves your stomach negotiating terms an hour later. Either way, your body is carrying a piece of history, a quiet piece, an ancient piece, a piece that has been traveling through generations long before you arrived. Inside you are traces of migrations you never walked. Inside you are traces of droughts you never experienced. Inside you are traces of winters you never endured. And yet, somehow, they're still there. Imagine two people standing in the same supermarket today. Same country, same technology, same shelves, same milk. Yet their digestive systems may be telling completely different stories. Stories about where their ancestors lived. Stories about what resources were available. Stories about which survival strategies worked and which didn't. That's what makes this so fascinating. Your digestion isn't just chemistry. It's ancestry. It's history. It's evolution still speaking through your body. Not conscious memory. Evolutionary memory, stored in genes, enzymes, and biological switches that have been passed from one generation to the next. A record that began before nations existed, before cities existed, before written language existed. And that record is still active every time you sit down to eat. Now think back to that person standing in a supermarket late at night, casually reaching for a gallon of milk. No hesitation, no second thought, just another item in the cart. Yet hidden inside that ordinary moment is a story stretching across thousands of years. A story involving animals, droughts, migrations, mutations, traditions, and survival. What looks like a shopping decision is actually the latest chapter in an evolutionary chain reaction. One generation influences the next. One culture influences the next. One adaptation influences the next. Imagine pulling farther and farther back, beyond the supermarket, beyond the highways and cities, beyond farms, kingdoms, and civilizations, beyond the first herders guiding cattle across dusty grasslands. Researchers estimate that Earth has hosted millions of species throughout its history. Most followed the same biological script: drink milk as infants, stop drinking it as adults. Humans did something different, or more accurately, some human populations did. They took a food meant for infancy and turned it into a resource that could help sustain entire societies. Not because milk changed first, because humans changed first. That's the pattern hiding underneath this entire story. Again and again, humans alter their surroundings. Again and again, humans create new pressures. Again and again, evolution responds. The species that changes its world eventually changes itself. Milk is only one example, a small example, but a revealing one. Because this story isn't ultimately about dairy. It's about a species that keeps rewriting the rules that shaped it, a species that modifies its environment, then adapts to the consequences. A species that became both the author and the subject of its own evolutionary story. We changed the food. Then the food changed us. Subscribe!